Keeping with the rock concert analogy, our next act is the plenary session, the role of energy storage in the energy transition. This is a conversation that will be moderated by Akshat Rati. He's a senior reporter at Quartz, specializing largely on energy and has written prolifically on the topic of energy storage. So I'd like to invite Akshat and the speakers to the stage. Please join me in welcoming them.
Is this working? Can you all hear me? Yeah? Well, while we get seated and we have an expert panel here, people from the finance world, from the technology world, from the analyst world, as we heard from Amy previously, I wanted to perhaps start with a story. I'm a journalist. I write for Quartz. I'm a senior reporter there covering energy and climate change. Energy storage is one of my favorite subjects. And so I wanted to start with a story to try and bring the discussion of what we are looking at over the next 30 years to one home. And that's my home, my parents' home back in India. I grew up in Nasik. It's a small town outside in west of India near Mumbai. Earlier this year, I got them rooftop solar. Mid-January, we started talking to developers. And we had plenty of options within our town to be able to get local developers to put those panels. By the end of March, we'd acquired the solar panels, had put up the structure needed to place them on the top of the roof, and the solar panels were ready to go. It then took 2 months to get the regulatory approval from the state electricity board to actually power the solar panels that was sitting on the roof for 2 months and use that electricity in the house. These are 2 months in the month of April and May, and any of you who've ever been to India know how hot it is, and it's the peak time when you want to use electricity. So they lost 2 months there in the bureaucracy. Now, the rooftop solar in India is connected to the grid, which means when there's a blackout, you cannot use the electricity that's being generated by your solar panels. You have to not use electricity because there's a blackout. It's connected to the grid. And so even though they have rooftop solar, even though they have a clean source of energy, which would suffice them most of the time in the day, they cannot use it when there's a blackout. So the next question, which my dad asked me earlier this month actually, was maybe we should think of getting batteries. And I said, that's probably a good idea. Can we talk to developers, find anybody who could supply them? And the answer was 0. He couldn't find anybody who would supply lithium-ion batteries in my town. He said, I'm going to try and look for suppliers in Mumbai, but let's see how things go. So that's where we are, right? This transition will happen in homes in countries like India, and we need to provide them the route to be able to make that transition. Of course, homes are one aspect, businesses, and everybody else needs to get involved, but those are the challenges that we face. Here we have a panel that will help us perhaps try and figure out what those challenges look like beyond the home in Nasik, and what are the opportunities and how we can fill them. And instead of doing a normal introduction, letting them give you an opening statement, I'm going to spice things up a little bit. They're going to introduce themselves, and they're going to answer one question. What do they think is the biggest myth in the energy storage industry? And we can just start with you.
Good morning. I'm Paul McCusker from Fluence. Just a little bit about Fluence. Fluence was born on the 1st of January 2018 with the bringing together of Siemens Energy Storage and AES Energy Storage. Both have been active before that, AES for more than 10 years. Fluence has deployed about 1.5 or built or in construction at the moment 1.5 gigawatt of storage. So we're significant in terms of what we do with storage around the world. I lead the team across EMEA markets, so looking forward to talking to you further about what we see today. In terms of the myth, I guess one of the things, and maybe it's become less of an issue, but it's topical, is the extent to which safety and reliability of storage is a barrier to moving forward. And what we would say to that is we have built systems more than 10 years ago. We've seen systems run very consistently for 10 plus years. And examples being in very harsh environments like the Atacama Desert in Chile, one of the longest running assets in our portfolio. And we think that's very relevant, particularly for some of the emerging markets where we see similar types of environments. And on the safety topic, it's something that deserves more discussion rather than being seen as a barrier to how we move forward.
And so that's great. And this is because these assets are 20, 25-year assets. That's how much money you're putting up front. And that's why having a longer safety record is also quite important.
Well, I think we would certainly encourage what we would call infrastructure assets. So, and I think it's in keeping with the discussion here, assets that are built, robust assets that are built as infrastructure for the long term. In some markets, we see shorter life assets, which may be more questionable in terms of some of the practices where market forces squeeze how we build those assets. But more discussion on the safety topic is relevant. And just to sort of reference your story at the start, earlier this year we deployed the largest battery scale storage system in India, in Delhi, a 10 megawatt system. So I'm not sure we can get down to the residential scale yet, but maybe we can talk on the side.
Yeah. Aida?
Thank you. Hello, Aida Sidikova. I'm Director for Energy Eurasia here at the bank. And the EBRD obviously spans a big territory. It's European is a misnomer, so we go from Mongolia to Morocco. But my part of the world is Central Asia, Caucasus, Mongolia, and Turkey. And the biggest myth related to storage that we are seeing in some of the countries that I cover, or my team covers, is the insurmountable level of costs and technical complexity that is being channeled to us by the transmission operators and the system operators. And this is something that we are trying to address head-on through very active, what we call policy work with the governments. But the fact is, there is a perception in some of our countries that storage is expensive, battery storage is expensive. There are other types of storage, of course, that are not coming to the forefront yet. And that might unfortunately impact the decision of some of the countries in terms of how much of renewable energy they will be deploying. So for us, the key things are, of course, is to break the myth, to work with the governments on establishing the regulatory framework, because that's another big uncertainty in terms of who is owning the storage assets. Is it generators? Is it transmission operator? Is it system operator? How the setup should be working? What is the infrastructure? What is the grid architecture in a specific country, and how it could be addressed there? So this is the myth that we are trying to overcome, and hopefully with the assistance from climate funds, co-financing there, given the large outlay of money upfront on projects like that, we should be succeeding with actually financing some specific storage projects in our countries.
And when you go to these countries, do you show them the charts that we saw from Amy or from your own projections, looking at, look, this is what has happened to solar, this is what is happening to batteries, this is why the cost is likely to come down? Do you talk to them about these projections? How are you received there?
Absolutely, and especially it's relevant because the countries are shifting to competitive procurement of energy, so they really see firsthand the low prices for renewables that are coming out of auctions. So they see what the competition can do. They see the cost of production coming down, to a large extent, of course, attributable to Chinese manufacturers and brutal competition there. But also there's a dynamic process that they can see where the price can actually land. So when we looked internally at the sort of superimposing and extrapolating potentially the cost of storage if it were to follow, say, the solar PV dynamic and trajectory. And we can see that, I mean, from 9 years ago, it dropped by 76%, for example, one of the statistics that we have. So what is there to tell that it's not going to be going the same, sort of following or close to the same trajectory? And of course, we are working with the countries on that, and hopefully there will be more openness and receptiveness.
That's great. Michael?
Hi, good morning. Michael Harper from Lockheed Martin Energy. So Lockheed's probably better known for defence and security, but energy resilience and energy security is a fundamental of national security and prosperity. And so Lockheed have been developing their energy business, particularly around battery storage. We have integrated lithium-ion solutions located in North America at the moment. Not quite the same deployment as Fluence, only maybe 100 megawatts, a few hundred megawatt hours. But we're also developing a flow battery technology for longer duration energy storage. And we see that the market will continue to ask for greater energy storage rather than just power applications as you get to higher penetrations of renewable. As you go beyond the sort of 70% into the 80 and 90%, where you've got large amounts of renewables, and we saw with the chart from Amy that significant amounts of curtailment will happen, and underutilization of that renewable energy resource will be had. With longer energy storage and duration energy storage, you can make better utilization of that, and that has to be good for a cost-effective and price value to the end customer, rather than having to depend on other means to deal with that excess energy storage. So from a myth perspective, I kind of struggled with this a little bit, thinking about it. But I think from my perspective, the myth is that the technology will not be the blocker to the energy transmission and transition, that companies like Lockheed Martin and Fluence will find ways to deliver that energy transition, and that it's really the incumbent systems that are already in place, the incumbent practices that ultimately are creating those barriers to market. The policy, the regulation, the current market structures, and then the incumbent system operators, so the transmission system, distribution system operators, and those that own non-renewable or non-clean generation assets. And again, I thought that Amy's keynote speech this morning was really good, that as battery storage prices come down and you start to get parity with the incumbent system operation prices, that there will be that significant change in.
But with innovation, there's always a timeline. And so, for example, with your scaling up of flow batteries, it's taken a while, and it's likely going to take a while.
It does.
And so, do we have the time, given we have a time deadline on how quickly we need to cut emissions and have deployment?
Money is a good cure for technology de-risking, certainly. So as you start to see the cost of implementing other systems as an alternative to energy storage, we've seen integrated resource planning numbers coming out of Europe and North America, and they are huge. That will drive further investment into battery storage and therefore expedite that timeline.
Right. Luis?
Hi everyone, I'm Luis Munuera. I'm with the International Energy Agency in Paris with the Strategy and Initiatives Office there. For those who don't know, the IEA is an international organization. It gives advice to its member governments, but more recently, more broadly, globally, there's a broader family of IEA members, including China, India, and emerging economies. And part of my role there at the IEA is to actually track emerging power sector technologies, storage in particular, and to look at how well are these technologies doing compared to our scenarios in the IEA. Some of you might be familiar with them. How well are they doing relative to that transition? And we put this together every year in a publication we call Tracking Clean Energy Progress. And this year we gave storage a green because of a lot of positive developments that we'll be talking about in this panel. Green meaning that it's on track with the transition. And now in terms of the myth on energy storage, in my own view, there's a very strong focus on lithium-ion and the idea that because of everything that's happening with electric vehicles, because of the large scale-up of battery manufacturing capacity, the cost of lithium-ion will come down on its own, and that's enough to have plentiful batteries everywhere. First point I would make there, it's still a very policy-dependent area. There's still a strong need for creation of markets, for the creation of favorable policy environments. We've seen it everywhere. Markets have grown very quickly wherever a favorable policy environment has been created. And the second aspect to highlight there, I think, is the focus on lithium-ion, the battery themselves, kind of gives less importance to a very critical aspect, I think, of battery deployment, which is everything that happens around the battery. So the soft cost, installation cost, balance of system, and so on. We see that it's a huge share, especially in emerging markets, in new markets, of initial costs. And those are critical aspects, integration of storage systems with existing systems and so on.
That's great. And in terms of the non-lithium-ion technologies, is there one that excites you the most?
In terms of non-lithium ion, I would say there's sometimes we tend to forget about some traditional forms of storage. For example, pumped hydro storage. So we have a forecast, a specific forecast every year, a 5-year forecast in the IEA. And this year we forecast over the next 5 years as much pumped hydro coming online around the world as battery storage, more or less in the same region. Also happening in developing countries. So we have in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Morocco, in Egypt, a bit all over the world.
Yeah, and for those who don't know what pumped hydro storage is, it takes us back to high school physics classes where you have water that you just raise to a certain height, you put potential energy, and then you convert that back into electrical energy whenever you need it. So it is a kind of a battery, just a much simpler battery that has existed for over 100 years. Chandra.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Chandra Govindrajlu from the World Bank and the Energy Practice. I lead the World Bank's energy storage program. So we look at storage both from the perspective of decarbonizing the power systems in middle-income countries and also from access perspective, because there are over 700 million people without access to electricity, particularly in Africa and Asia. In the keynote speech, we saw the deployment across the world has really ramped up. Unfortunately, Africa has been left out. I mean, there is about only 3 gigawatts installed in Africa as of 2018, and of that, 2.6 is in South Africa. So there's a lot of catch-up to be done there. And I think that is important for the context of the CIF program and as well as all the MDB's work in emerging markets. So in terms of the myth, having addressed that footnote to the keynote, in terms of the myth, I think the notion that declining battery costs are really going to increase deployment is not correct. You need enabling regulations in place to spur this market really. You need basic classifications and regulations. You need participation in ancillary markets, markets to develop. All those value chains need to be realized. And for that, the regulatory framework needs to be in place. And without that, you're not going to get very far, even if the prices come down.
That's great. All right, so in about half an hour, 20 minutes, I'll come to you for questions because I know you will have questions and there are these experts who would love to answer them. But I'm going to try and pull out some of the threads from there so that you have more context to ask your question. Perhaps on the regulation side, Luis, maybe you can explain to us what goes right when you put the right framework. And maybe South Korea is a good example where we've seen in a matter of a few years, handful of years, going from nearly nothing to a lot of energy storage deployment. What happened there and what can we learn from that?
So I guess, the South Korea example is a very good one. It has pluses and positives and negatives, or maybe the negatives, I would say, lessons learned. On the one hand, it's a market already. So there's a lot of markets that are already very developed in South Korea. When we're talking about developing countries, we also have to think about the fact that the market doesn't exist very often. So there's a question there of how to deploy storage when the market is absent. In the case of South Korea, in the case of other more developed countries, the range of incentives have been different. Sometimes it's been direct procurement, sometimes it's been a target that the government has set, and then and sometimes it's been a mandate for a certain amount of storage. That changes a lot. I think the main thing that I would have learned from the Korean example is the need to have a stable framework that works over several years and that kind of respects the fact that there's a learning by doing that needs to happen in the country. So last year there were some stories in the headlines in Korea about fires in different installations in Korea. Some of that means like literally the market might be overheating in some aspects. But that means that you actually, it's great to have a range of policy incentives. That depends really on the country. As I said, very dependent on policy. But then it's very important to have a clear, transparent framework that is durable over time. That it is not just a one-off. That creates a market very quickly and then kind of stops.
Right. And Paul, maybe on safety, taking the Korean example where again it's been a success story in deployment, and then we've not seen those scales of fires anywhere else, and that's made the industry take a look at themselves as every industry would like to. And what have you learned and what have you done about it?
Sure. Yeah, I think safety has definitely gotten more attention since the Korean incident, and indeed ourselves, we had an incident in Arizona at a facility, an APS facility. Yeah, I guess it highlights that, as with any, we're working in the energy industry. There's batteries, like other technologies, require appropriate safety measures. So I think there's been in some markets, I'm less familiar with the Korean example, but I've seen it in other markets where there's been a lot of hype and excitement about storage opening, and maybe a lot of people running at it for the first time. And in some of that enthusiasm to capture that market opening, maybe not enough attention was paid to the safety topics. Maybe in some cases the level of sophistication in terms of how you actually look after and the battery, conditions around how you look after the battery. Maybe in some of those instances it was, some of those players had a little bit less experience or didn't recognize some of the important parameters. But I guess it just shows there's a little bit more to it than solar or wind from that respect in terms of how you look after the asset. We've been doing that for more than 10 years, and with a lot of data, probably as much as anyone in terms of running the systems, and we continue to learn. I think it's cliche, but it's a continuous improvement exercise. The battery technology is changing and evolving. The manufacturers they're learning and they're adjusting parameters and controls as we go. So I think there's a need for continued focus, engagement on the safety topic across from suppliers right through to owner-operators.
And there's the example of the lead acid industry where lead is one of the most recycled materials. It's also pretty toxic, but if you recycle it and use it, you can use it well. Of course, that only happens if it's strongly regulated. And so in European markets, in American markets, you get strong regulation around recycling and those are followed. Then you take recycling to Africa, to Kenya specifically, or India, and there are horror stories of how they're recycled. So what the lead industry is doing is coming together and trying to have industry players, have companies that are more responsible, try and put pressure on other companies. Do you see that happening in the lithium-ion industry? Is there a conglomerate of, say, Lockheed Martin and Fluence and other battery companies that have a network that try and push for what is best for the industry?
I think it's in all our interest to raise those standards and continue the discussion that's happening on the safety topic right now. On the recycling point specifically, I think without exception, almost every project that we would do, we have an arrangement with the manufacturer where they're taking back the cells at the end of life, back through the port where it's coming into the country or a designated drop site, and recycling those batteries. I know that is, and I've seen with some engagements in Africa, it's a sensitive topic to make sure that same network applies and works well. And I guess we can't take it for granted. It needs closer scrutiny in some of those countries.
And Michael, maybe one aspect that would be interesting to hear, lithium-ion batteries, we all have them in our phones, some of them have them in our cars, and so we know what it looks like, a black box that, produces power when we want it to. Flow batteries are very different. And sure. Maybe I think the audience would love to know what a flow battery looks like and why should we go after a new type of battery at all?
Okay, can I first comment on the safety side of things on the lithium? I think the community around the development of battery energy storage systems has really pulled together, and standardization around safety has become much more robust as a result of the fires. We as a company have taken much more consideration around how safe our batteries are and made sure that we test against those. But those standards needed to develop, and they have developed, and now I think certainly we're confident as an integrator of lithium-ion that that is a safe system that we can deploy, and we understand the effects of thermal runaway and the likes in the system. So I would say that is something that is being addressed very significantly. On a flow battery perspective, a flow battery is not a closed solid state or solid electrolyte material as you have with lithium-ion batteries. It's a liquid battery, so we have a positive and a negative electrolyte held in big vats for the electrolyte, and that electrolyte is then flowed between past a membrane, and the ionic exchange between the positive and the negative electrolyte occurs at that membrane boundary. And we have hundreds of membranes in a stack with the liquid flowing past to release the energy, and then to recharge it, you reverse the process, and you flow the liquid in the other direction and recharge the battery.
And the attraction is that you, instead of having multiple batteries, you can just increase the size of the tank, and the length of the time for which the battery can run can be easy. Sure. So scaling up seems relatively easy just from a pure physics perspective.
Correct. So with lithium-ion, you buy power and energy with every cell that you buy, and you have to manage your power and energy relationship as you go to larger scales. And so as you get to greater durations of energy, you're still buying power and energy all the time, and there's there isn't the benefits of or the reductions in costs that you'd see with potentially with a flow battery, where the power and energy are completely decoupled. The power is held in this membrane stack and the amount of and the size of that, and then your energy is held in the amount of electrolytes that you have within the system. So yeah, if you want to go to longer durations, you just top up the tank with a little bit of extra electrolyte, and it is relatively cheap. You're not spending a lot of more money on the additional balance of plant and controls that you'd need to manage that extra power.
Right, and I think for technology enthusiasts amongst us, we'll probably see more of these examples, which are non-lithium-ion, non-simple batteries that will come up. One that I wrote about last year, which has recently raised $100 million from SoftBank, is a company called Energy Vault, and all it does is it builds a concrete tower when you have electricity available. The blocks of concrete are sitting on the floor, you build them up, and then when you want the electricity back, you undo your concrete tower. So it doesn't look like a battery in any form, but it just still stores energy, and you can retrieve energy as and when you need it. Louise, you had a point to make.
Building on Michael's answer right now, so maybe worth highlighting the importance of, before deploying any storage program, any storage policy, the importance of having a sound cost-benefit analysis. In developed countries, very often the cost-benefit analysis falls on the side of, there's a value for frequency regulation, for power quality, and so on. In a developing country context, maybe that might be less important than actually having firm capacity and having maybe longer storage duration. And their flow batteries should eventually, for example, be a quite attractive technology in terms of longer storage durations. It's a challenge to have to do the cost-benefit analysis when you don't have the markets. Markets tend to be very good at revealing value. But still, I mean, it's a fundamental thing. We've seen in many countries where programs have started, and perhaps that sound, solid basis of what's the value and what's the cost and the benefits have been ignored.
And Ida, we are here to try and push the transition to happen faster in developing countries where structures are weird, weak, choose an adjective. How, you've worked with them for a while. How is it, where do you see success, and how does that, do you take success from one country and to another? Like, what's your experience on that?
Yeah, weird and weak probably does apply to some countries that we cover. In terms of the regulatory setup, I would use a more diplomatic word probably of nascent stage of renewables development, which we're pushing. But I have to say that, the countries, even those countries that have not fully embraced renewables, they've been looking at storage. Hydropump was, we financed the first hydropump storage project in 2000 in Russia, for example. So it's not something that, the whole concept is not completely new. You mentioned dropping concrete. I read an article in Guardian dropping rocks down the mine shaft. It's also sort of storage solution. We have smart grids. We have grid reinforcement in some of our countries as approaches that they are taking. We have pro-consumers, demand management. So it's all sort of part. I know there's a revolution going on with lithium batteries. And by the way, on the safety, we have to be mindful of the mining aspect of things. The lithium, which in itself is a finite resource, has to be mined. So the mining has to be sustainable as any other mining. So if we look at the whole value chain, it's pretty much, it has to be watched, it has to be regulated. But what we want to see, where we want to see less of regulation is actually in the markets themselves, because we at the BRD strongly believe in the force of the private sector and what the private sector can develop. And we've seen that with renewables. We see the shift from feed-in tariffs, high subsidies, that sort of policy-driven deployment, to more market-based structures, to private investors coming and competing. So once the storage as a product or as a service is defined in this or that country, and they don't have to wait for 100% deployment of renewables, once storage is deployed, it's really a question of who is paying for the service.
What countries? Can you give perhaps specific examples from your own work where you've seen that work in a country, and then what can you learn, and how can other countries use that?
Well, we've seen the speed of deployment in renewables, for example, Central Asia. There are two major markets for us. There it's Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And the two countries chose very different routes of how they will go about renewables in terms of PPA structure, in terms of bankability, in terms of actually national targets and the appetite for large scope. And we've seen results that are different at the end of the day, a very different timeline, but they're still sort of converging into the lower prices driven by competition. So to us, the biggest lesson learned is that, yes, you need some push initially from the government. This is where we come and work, what we call policy work, hand in hand with actual investments. We put money also into the project together with climate finance partners. And then after that, at a certain time, the lesson is that we see the situation where the market can take over. And that's where we want to, and this is what we see in countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, which achieved incredible 2.68 cents price as of 4 weeks ago in Uzbekistan during their first auction. This is quite record-breaking for the region.
And Chandra, you made that point, which is, I think, very important. We should remember how much of a deployment challenge is still remaining, and Africa is, that way lagging in these deployments. What is it that is stopping this happening if the economic forces have sort of won out in 2/3 of the world? What are you seeing as the big challenges?
Obviously there is, in terms of the interest, there is a lot of interest in African countries to benefit from the falling costs in solar, which they can't really take advantage of because of the fragile grids and so on. We have a good pipeline of projects already. We have something in in West Africa and Burkina Faso that is developing. In fact, our first project that was approved by our board was in Central African Republic, which is under implementation. So it's not that there are challenges in terms of the awareness is not there. Often it's not easy to attract private sector into the remotest markets. It's easier to attract them in middle-income countries. For example, I have a case of a project in the Pacific where one of the major battery companies couldn't, was not able to deliver the product. I mean, it's a question of where the market is concentrated. So that is one of the barriers. Also awareness and conditions. As we know, the most common technology with the track record that we have is lithium ion, which also has which has to be operated at temperatures which are not that, which are easily breached in the context of India or Africa. So those are the key challenges. We are trying, but the economics are so strong that hopefully that these will be overcome sooner than later. So one other point I wanted to make was that we are at a conference of the CIFs and talking about storage. We would be remiss if we don't mention molten salt and CSP storage, where CIF and MDBs have made a big investment, and Mazen in Morocco has done such a terrific job. And now that's also goes to talking about longer duration storage to some extent, as well as now they're trying battery and a combination of battery and molten salt. In the afternoon, we have a session on ESP and the Energy Storage Partnership, where we are looking at options beyond battery storage in that spirit.
Yeah, and that's a good. Do you see more CSP happening? It sort of feels that if we talk about it in the clean energy world, CSP is the original solar plus battery. And it's been around for quite some time, but it's always been considered as a slightly more expensive technology. Do you see that changing in the next 10 years? Is that your sense?
It's given what's happening on the battery side these days, it's not easy because CSP is also location specific. DNI has to be really good at a good level, whereas PV's costs are also coming down and storage costs are also coming down. But having said that, there is also discussion, I think we will hear in the afternoon from, there is also the possibility of using the molten salt, which was a part of CSP, as a independent thermal storage. That possibility is there. I mean, those are still at very early stages. But given the right DNI and right environment, I think CSP still has a chance.
One aspect that Chandra raised was the grid. Grids are a constraint, not just for renewables, but for storage. In some ways, storage can try and relieve some of those constraints. What are you seeing from that perspective of, A, how can batteries improve the grid, and B, how can batteries perhaps extend the grid? Because that is something that, as a technology, they are capable of, but are you seeing that happening?
Yeah, so I mean that's a key application for storage, especially when we discuss in OECD or developed country context, that basically to defer or to even completely remove the need for investing in a transmission upgrade or in a distribution network upgrade. I think one big challenge there in developing countries is the lack of information of what's happening on grids, so the lack of visibility of the topology of how the grid is planned and how it's laid out, as well as what is the condition of the grid, what is the condition of different components. So that's a challenge on one side. On the other side, it's also an opportunity now with digitalization. So we're seeing very cost-effective ways of improving the understanding of what are the needs, where could storage deliver the biggest value on the network. And we have, for example, there's been an initiative recently by Facebook and of all companies and Columbia University, where they've used artificial intelligence in a developing country context to map or predict where the network might need to go and where the network actually is today, because very often that information is lacking. So that combination of kind of ground truths, like getting a better understanding of what the grids are, and then using these remote sensing technologies to actually get a much better understanding of where storage could give the biggest value.
And we should not forget, I mean, Kenya is where M-Pesa was created. It's the, in digitalization, it's been one of the pioneers, and so there's no reason why we can't see that leap happening in developing countries where perhaps that's the cheapest and quickest route out from the old technology to where we need to go. Maybe from your experience in Arizona, because as I understand, in Arizona, that is perhaps some of the role that batteries have played, which is to stabilize the grid and perhaps be that point where if there's too much solar, it doesn't fry the grid, and there's short-term storage battery solutions, not just for peak hours, but for grid stability.
Yes. I guess using storage in place of as an alternative to building, going through a planning route to years and years of and a much more costly build out for a new line. Storage is a like the examples in Arizona, a very valid alternative to that. It's been used there in a number of projects, and it's primarily with more solar coming in, putting stress on points of the grid, and you either stop your renewables deployment and wait for this long build out, or you add storage as you need it incrementally, and that's been very effective. I think it's the next big frontier in storage in both the developing and the developed world, to start to look at our grids in a different way, in terms of how they evolve in a flexible way. Because storage, there's lots of problems, and we think it's important to focus on the very specific jobs to be done in different locations, as opposed to, hey, storage solves everything. Ultimately, we're providing a flexible resource, a flexible technology that helps you manage things better. And even the example I cited at the start about the India project, that's putting storage in a densely populated area, a substation that's supporting 2 million people, and that storage asset came online earlier this year. It's providing greater resilience at a stress point. It's managing the peaks, it's providing services, and ultimately strengthening that node on the system.
Right, and it's not just expertise here, but there's expertise in the audience. 10 minutes, I'm coming to you, but some more questions from my side. So Ida, one question I wanted to ask you was on pumped hydro storage. The technology, as I said, is very simple. Like batteries, they have a very high capital cost upfront. They also take a long time to build, and then there are other environmental costs attached to it. And you've funded some of these projects. More of them are coming. When a country is looking at requirement, how do they evaluate whether we go for pumped hydro or we go for batteries? What are the criteria?
Yeah, it's a good question, because indeed we are working in some countries like Georgia, which is hydro-dominated, or Tajikistan and Central Asia, which are hydro-dominated, which are using their large hydro projects as sort of a storage facility. And you're absolutely right that the large hydros have historically been very sensitive in terms of environmental, social, and the community outreach issues. And they do entail a lot of capex upfront. So the risks are quite high. So we have been financing those, but it's not a very quick process. It takes a lot of rigor and control. It takes full compliance with our guidelines, for example, which is not an easy task to accomplish. So the government at a certain point do have to take, to weigh whether they are taking full advantage of, arguably cheap hydro and available hydro that they have and use it as storage, or they are going into the direction of future storage, of battery storage, for example. And what we see is that it really is driven by the penetration of non-hydro renewables. So that's when the penny drops, I think. So when the countries are going after larger, say, gigawatts of solar and wind, this is when the transmission operator usually raises the red flag, and where they start thinking about storage solutions. countries where, say, 20% penetration of renewables, for example, Mongolia, very, very poor infrastructure in terms of the grid, but they have relatively high share of renewables. So what the country is thinking now is actually a storage project in Mongolia, which would not be your sort of natural intuitive candidate for that sort of thing. But I think it's really non-hydro renewables that are driving this, with full understanding of the risks of large hydros.
Lisa.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that, like one additional point on pump hydro, of course, you mentioned the long lead time. So there's been recently a public consultation process in France to study, which kind of the question you were asking, like which technology we go for, and of course, like the long lead time, especially given the changing nature, more so in a developing country context of the energy mix, the expansion of transmission distribution networks and so on, and the fact that pump hydro is pretty much constrained. So we go more and more towards a world where not just how much and when you're generating, but where you're generating or storing and distributing electricity is much more important with distributed energy, with variable renewables and so on. So pumped hydro, of course, I mean, it's one of the first points I made, I think has a key role to play. But the modularity that some of these technologies bring, like batteries, you can put them anywhere.
So, but if that's the case, and I think we understand that the advantages of lithium-ion batteries or modularity of smaller batteries or other smaller energy storage technologies. Why is it that we are still seeing large deployments of pumped hydro?
I think to some degree is that it's a lot of the deployments happen in vertically integrated markets. It's something that a vertically integrated utility can kind of shoulder all the risks, and can kind of see it in a very centralized way as well. So there's a certain vision of the system, I think, that comes with that kind of, if you're thinking about what do I do about my distribution grid separately, to what do I do with my generation, and so on. There's other ideas that can come in, and very often that kind of the regulation, for example, for the distribution network operator to value an investment in a battery is not there yet, or it's not rewarded as it should be. The value is not rewarded as it should be. So,
no, I just wanted to add that countries, especially countries like India, they are looking for seasonal storage. You can get that with pumped hydro. You can't get that with batteries at this. The other also final point is that in terms of providing frequency response service and some of the other things that the rotating inertia based machine, those can provide, we are almost there, I would say, but still there's an advantage.
Maybe tell us a little bit about perhaps the seasonal question, where there are energy storage technologies, say hydrogen, for example, which could potentially do the seasonal storage for us. Is that something that industry is looking at all?
I think, yeah, very much so. I think the market is a little bit further out than the shorter duration battery storage, which is now, and longer duration, where you're looking at maybe 24 hours or 48 hours of energy storage. But certainly, particularly if you want to decarbonize the heat side of the world, then you have to reduce your amount of reliance on thermal generation with brown fuels or black fuels, and you need to turn to some green fuels, and certainly hydrogen or biomethane provide those solutions. And because the energy is stored in a chemical, it's easy to store for long durations. It provides you that seasonal backup that you can't get from a chemical store like a battery, which would ultimately degrade, or the value of it. And with flow batteries, the electrolyte doesn't degrade over time when it holds electricity, but to get its return on investment and to get that capital revenue generation, you need to be cycling it and getting it operating. And so, yeah, certainly there is a big market for the seasonal side of the piece, but the quick and early transitional pieces will be the shorter duration energy storage and the longer duration.
I think it was an interesting point from the presentation earlier from BNEF about overbuilding and curtailing renewables is still cheaper than looking at some of these alternatives. And if you think about that, sometimes we get fast, we get honed in on trying to solve that curtailment problem, but ultimately the economics of the situation will sort itself out. We'll either find a use for that cheap, abundant energy, or another technology solution to convert it some way. But the immediate challenges that we have today, I think we're some way off needing to look at that.
That's great. Okay, I'm opening this for questions. Please raise your hands. I'm going to try and look out for people here. We have 2 questions here up front, and then 2 back. I'll come there. And so just introduce yourself. Keep it short, and if you want to address it to one of the panelists, say so. If you want anyone to pick it up, say so.
Good morning. The name is Ranjiv Gunawardena from GCC. The gentleman from the World Bank mentioned about doing things in Africa, and you mentioned Central African Republic, did you? Right. Could you expand upon the story that you have there? And the other panelists, I mean, what's holding you back from entering the African market? Because right now, the company that I represent, Genera Climate Care, we are actually heavily involved in the African market, especially in the SADC region, from Angola, Zimbabwe, and DRC. So we got access to the right people at the presidential level. But again, there seems to be a bit of a bottleneck of people actually going out there doing things apart from the World Bank.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Chandra, do you want to
Should
take
we
that?
take a few questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
Alexander Silin, Highview Power. We do long-term energy storage based on cryogenic technology, and I have a question that's probably not geographically located, but technology-driven. A lot of the systems that we talk about long-term, technology is going to be new. Either the technology itself or the scale is going to be much bigger, and it's always a question, how do you finance that? How do you get lenders pretty comfortable, and what are the vehicles to promote the scale-ups or new technologies in this field? It's probably the question to EBRD and World Bank.
Yeah, that's great. I'll take one more, and then we'll do around. Just the one in front, and then I'll come back.
Arnold Maber from Dipania Global. I am interested in your views when it comes to the role of policy. There's an example in New York where the government has intervened to encourage investment, whereby both generation and storage are being enabled by, if you like, legislative frameworks and government intervention. Do you see that as an essential, or do you see that as something that can happen either through technological innovation or in terms of research? I'm not sure where Fluence and Lockheed are particularly going and how that could be an interplay.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we start with the innovation question, because that's, to me, feels one that doesn't overlap. And maybe on the point he was trying to make, which is any innovation requires money, as Michael made it clear as well. You know, if you push more money, there's a greater chance of success. Does EBRD look at innovation as a portfolio, and if so, what are the ways in which you think about?
Yeah, EBRD operates in sort of 2 major ways. One is the policy work that the gentleman just mentioned, that allows us to talk to the governments and help them and provide potentially grant financing to help them develop the frameworks that would be working. And the second way is, of course, the actual financing of the projects. So the logic is that we would be able to create some sort of level playing field at some point in our countries that we as a lender would be able to finance. And as a lender, we often have, we co-finance with others, with other international financial institutions, with climate funds, with commercial banks. And the point there is that we're driven by the market. So it has to be bankable. We are not subsidizing our financing. It has to stand on its own legs, and it has to be bankable. To get to that stage, again, this is the first stream of our work that we're working on. Some technologies do lend themselves, very early stage, do lend themselves to probably different type of investors, you know, seed capital, venture sort of type of thing. But at a certain point, they become more sort of widespread, more economically justifiable, and that's where EBRD is entering.
Got it. And Chandra, maybe you can take the point on Africa and what's stopping more countries.
Sure. Yeah, on that, basically it's driven by the markets which are dominated by heavy fuel oil and diesel, right? In those environments, the tariffs are plus 20%, 20 cents normally. So in those environments, solar plus storage makes a lot of sense. So we are seeing interest from Gambia, Central African Republic, now Burkina Faso, where solar plus storage can bring down your price of power to if not even the 5, 6, 7 cents, but even if it's 11, 12 cents, it's still like a big reduction from what you were paying before. So that's really driving that. And many of these are small grids, city level grids, not mini grid, micro grids, city level grids. And on the point regarding new technologies, right? IFC, my colleague Peter is here, has made investments in early stage companies. For example, many years ago, they made an investment in Fluidic, which is now NANT, which is zinc air. So there have been examples like that.
Development banks do get involved sometimes in early stage development, but usually the goal is, as Ida made it clear, is towards deployment and creating a market so that then there are more
basically on the World Bank public side, we have to go with what our clients, the governments, their risk appetite, and we get into near commercial technology. We have funded CSP, but really early stages, there is a little bit of room there. But again, with more with the hands-on, VC funds and so on working together.
Michael, you had something to add.
From an investment perspective, yes, these systems have got relatively high capital investment, and bankable is absolutely right. The newer technologies have more flexibility, are more durable, potentially, have greater capacity and greater duration, and so they have applications which are not realised in the market yet, and you don't have a clear. I'm going to pick this ancillary service over here and this piece above. And sometimes even then regulation where you can't do grid services, transmission, distribution, upgrade, deferral and congestion management, along with the liberalised market applications are split. And so that's really very challenging. What I'd like to see is the potential to look at innovation where you're looking at an innovative technology in an innovative regulatory environment so that you can demonstrate what the potential is of those technologies as they move forward.
Perhaps on the New York State point, Paul, maybe from, again, Arizona is also a similar example, not quite as strong as New York. New York had a very strong mandate, but Arizona made storage easier to be deployed.
I think whether it's New York or California or any of these places that are making proactive gestures to encourage storage, let's say, or create that's good, of course. But, we would say the best course of action is just to remove any natural barriers that exist in the system against the technology. Let it compete on a commercial basis against other technologies, whether it's gas or whatever it might be. And when you do that, storage emerges, and there's lots of places where some of those barriers are holding things back or making it difficult. It's always welcomed when certain places like New York want to go beyond that and push their own renewables threshold.
Well, that answer is instructive also. The fact that somebody from industry is saying, we don't want more support, if you let us compete, we will be able to compete. That's a very strong statement, and where the prices come down to on storage. A few more questions there. Back, yep.
Thank you. Vivek Mittal from Mirrors Capital. I would challenge the case for storage in developing countries. For off-grid, let's say telecom towers, which is very critical, I think reliable solar plus storage as a replacement for diesel is some ways off. And I'm sat here next to Amy and Louisa who can correct me if I'm wrong. For on-grid, yes, there's a role for grid stability. But longer storage is far off. it's got to be far better for developing countries to focus on energy efficiency and demand response than go with curtailment plus storage. That's my perception, but
right.
your comments.
Got it. And there's a question here, and there's one there, and then one here.
I'm Melbourne Jani from Asia Capital Partners. My question is around the economics of storage and how you make it work in terms of the revenue stacking model. And
Sorry,
is the model an EPC-based model or solar plus storage, or is it revenue stacking through frequency response? Because the economics for me aren't clear as to how you scale up.
Right. And there's a question here in front. Yeah.
It's about safety and management. You mentioned about the South Korean case for the fire cases, and that there was a 23 fire incident during the 22 months from the summer of 2018, and that's out of 1,500 ESS. So if you calculate, it's 1.5%. And is there any insurance facility is placed for this sort of case? If you want to go to bankable PPA, that should be reflected on the price.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Again, does somebody want to take, Chandra want to take the question about that maybe developing countries don't need to look at storage right now. There are critical assets that would require them, maybe a cell tower or something, but curtailment can be.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is interesting because countries where it's pure, like for the cell phone towers and all that, it makes a lot of sense. But you can't jump into storage, at a high scale without knowing what it is, what value it provides, how it operates, what kind of warranty issues, guarantee issues you need to think about. So there are so many issues around that, and it is a complex technology. Like the battery energy system, the cells, the container, the fire suppression, and HVAC, and so on, right? And how do the warranties stack up? How does everything work? I mean, and who is going to be accountable if something happens? And if something happens, it's gone. That's it. So that for all those reasons, we have interest among middle-income countries as well as developing low-income countries to test, try, and get up to speed on that. So it's also because of that.
I think just a comment. There are opportunities across all countries for storage. If you look at specific jobs to be done, like mentioned before, but pushing the technology as a solution to everything is not what we advocate at all. If the economics make sense, then business will pull in storage or governments will pull in storage. And I would say we have seen a step change this past year in activity in Africa and elsewhere, where industry is industrial customers, or maybe they're going with their solar farm to support their industrial complex or their mine, and now they're also mandating storage to be part of that because it's part of the mix, and it's ultimately reducing the cost of their energy supply and making it more resilient. So industrial customers are doing that. They're making those choices. They're proceeding because it's just lower cost and more reliable. And the fundamentals, where it stacks up.
Luis, maybe you can answer the question on stacking. How do you, apart from the fact that batteries can provide electricity, which is great, there's a cost to electricity, you pay that cost. That's one way of making money. There are these smaller services, and explain what those services are and how do you make them work in a financial way?
So I mean, it's a complicated question on stacking. So generally, when we do, you go into a country and you do a study of, what's the future energy mix going to look like, you do grid integration studies. Generally, you see always storage coming up. Now the challenge is in a kind of technology agnostic, abstract view of the world, and you're doing modeling. That's fine. You see a country, there's a value in there. However, how do you create a case for that actually to be built? That's very complicated. It depends on specific markets that can be created. For example, as you said, so there's ancillary services, or supporting frequency, or support even in local networks, supporting voltage and so on. There's, as we mentioned before, transmission deferral, so basically postponing or removing the need for a new transmission or a distribution line. There's a black start capability, so when the system goes down, just bring it back up, and having that storage asset on the side that can help you do that. That's a whole range of services. However, you can build a case like that, if we had these markets. However, you don't have actually if you don't create those markets that can value those services, can value how fast storage can respond, or how often an asset can respond, it's very challenging to build a case. And in that sense, there's something that we've seen in the developed country context that, in my view, could be also valuable in a developing country context is regulatory sandboxes. So to be able to say, okay, well, right now we may not have a market for something, but we can create an environment which is ring-fenced, which is somewhere where we can experiment with, if we actually rewarded, like the gentleman there said, frequency regulation, what in this particular system would be the revenues that we would get over the year and so on in this year and the next 5 years and so on.
And on the question about insurance, I mean, it's a smart question. 23 out of 1,500, so 1.5%, sure, in 1 year, which may be large, small, depends. But from Fluence or Lockheed Martin, do you take insurance into consideration? Are there already insurance providers for you when you are developing a project? What's the status?
Yeah, the insurance market has been evolving in its support for energy storage. I think I think there's cover there. What I would say is, speaking from Fluence, as a technology and service provider, most, if not all, of the systems we deploy, we're not an owner operator. We deploy the technology. We're technology agnostic, so different batteries, different systems, but we're providing it to a customer, and then we're looking after it under an LTSA for 10, 15, 20 years. So we're there, to mention your point on warranties, to help the customer manage through some of that complexity. And I think the focus on rising standards, the insurance industry will also get behind that, and it's in everyone's interest to push the standards and proactive measures that we take to a higher level.
All right, last set of questions. Who else is left here? Have we tried to answer questions? Am I stopping everybody from coffee? Do they need coffee now? Well, I'd say please thank Paul, Michael, Ida, Louise, and Chandra for their thoughts.